We're in the middle of our short form series on how to respond to the charge that the Gospels and the New Testament are largely mythological, imaginary, made up scenarios. We'll get even deeper into this when we talk about, well, how so? How are they? How did and the copycat claim, which is a subcategory of a skepticism that's gained some ground because of the internet, not necessarily because of substantive scholarship that's been done in the area. But we'll look at, okay, well, if we assume the Gospels are mythology, how did it work out? And they would say, well, they just copied fanciful tales from other cultures. This was a Jewish amalgamated legend story where Jesus likely was someone who existed, but they just embellished about him over the years, and the fish story grew, right? This is the position of university when it comes to Christianity. No scholarship's gone in the direction of substantiating that. In fact, all the scholarship's gone in the opposite direction of substantiating the legendary Jesus idea. But we'll talk about that in future effects. Right now, we're talking about the general mythological charge as opposed to the subcharge of parallelism or copycat, the copycat, euphemistically or idiomatically called the copycat theory. So we're getting to some issues with regard to how we could quickly respond to this sort of thing. We talked first about the fact that we have to take the New Testament authors seriously. They in their writings distance themselves from being considered mythology. What do we do with those passages? We call them liars, I suppose. The second thing we said is when you look at people that are experts and have read thousands of hours of ancient mythology, they do not think that the Gospels belong in that genre. And this has even converted skeptics that tend to default to the mythology claim to get rid of the Gospels as a serious contender for considering who Jesus was. Because there's supernatural elements in it, you just get rid of it. This is the perspective of somebody like probably the world's best known New Testament critic, Bart Ehrman at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, who says historians are just not allowed to take any supernatural anything seriously and remain what he would call authentic boots on ground historian. And we could talk about that and slice that up, but that's, again, we're hoping historians work with a methodological naturalism, an idea that methodologically, that in their method, they're not going to just jump to a conclusion that's supernatural, but we also don't want them to avoid a supernatural conclusion if it happens to be warranted. That's just to be fair. So let's look at our third approach to this, and this is the claim, even though it's under number 2 here in the PowerPoint. Legend, mythical development takes time and remoteness. And this is not what you're looking at with regard to development. There has been work over the years where Homer and Herodotus were taken seriously as test cases in how embellishment develops over the years. And though myths can spring up rather quickly on the historic landscape, especially if they're just imaginary, what scholars were able to determine was this, that it takes about 2 generations, anywhere between 55 and 75 years, for the mythology, the mythological, the imaginative, the embellishment, for a legend to wipe out the historic core. So if there's a historic core, this is how it really happened, this is how it really went down, then the embellishment sometimes accompanies that. But when the embellishment wipes out the historic core, that takes time. And here's why. You have to get distance from people that could disprove your theory by saying, well, I was there. Just like John says in 1 John, like Peter says, like Paul instructs his protégés. You have to get away from this sort of thing. So in other words, you need remoteness, distance from, say, where the events took place, and time, so that there's no person to step up and say, I was there, that did or did not happen. So 2 generations is about what we're working with, not necessarily it takes that for a myth to come up and to spring up, or even for embellishment to happen to a historic core, but for that embellishment, that mythological content that's being added, that fish story that's growing, to wipe out set known historical content that was based in space-time history, that had the weight of eyewitnesses behind it. So the New Testament, believe it or not, even though it's slow by modern standards, it taking something like between Jesus' death and resurrection from about 33 AD to about the last book, Revelation, being written around the 90s, that's still too little time for this movement to add significant exaggeration to wipe out the historic core. We'll talk about ways of discussing this in a moment, but I wanted to bring as my example 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul refers to a Christian belief, something he's passing on that he has received at the beginning of chapter 15 in that incredible book to the early Christians in Corinth. Even the most skeptical scholars will not put this creed. Now, this is already a summarized, developed creed that Paul passes on at the end of his letter to this early fledgling church in Corinth. They'll put it to anywhere between 1 and 5 years after Jesus' death on the cross. Now, why is this important? Well, remember what we just said. You need time and remoteness. You need a lot of people to be dead, no eyewitnesses, and maybe even remoteness geographically to embellish in a way where you can wipe out some historic details of the person in question. So what you have here in 1 Corinthians 15 is Paul very clearly saying that this is already a creed, the central focus of the faith that he's passing on, that he's received. That means right out of the canon, within 5 years of 33, before 40 AD, you already have a developed incarnational resurrection belief in Jesus as Lord, first starting amongst monotheistic Jews, which would find this enormously jarring and counterintuitive and countercultural to say any human was to be put alongside Yahweh or Adonai. So you have this right there, right out the canon, this sort of thing happening in 1 Corinthians 15. There's just not enough time for significant legend, myth, or even embellishment to wipe out the historic core. So we could also look at what even critics will say is likely the earliest, because it has the least amount of detail, the least amount of words. It's an action-oriented, something probably written to the Romans, the recollections of Peter through his scribe, Mark. In the Gospel of Mark, you have an incredible testimony of Jesus' true identity at his trial in Mark 14. And we see, again, very, very early on, and I've known people that have taken Dr. Ehrman in class to task on Mark 14 and Jesus' trial and what looks like a triple affirmation of his deity, if not a fourfold, causing Ehrman to write one of his books that maybe they're trying to set up Jesus as kind of like a New Testament hybrid archangel. And then, again, his Christian academic critics coming after that idea and saying, no, Jesus is still very, very different than even an archangel or the angel of the Lord that was a pre-incarnate showing up of Jesus. All right, I'm getting in the weeds. But this is our third argument, that there's just not enough time, even for the university position of legendary Jesus embellishment. You have right out the gate. And you can even look at a long dead but a phenomenal German scholar, Martin Hengel, that talks about this as well, that right out of the gate, you have at least the two bare bones prominent features of Christianity right there out the gate: Jesus' deity and his resurrection. And so that doesn't look like it got embellished and added later. You just don't have the time or the geographic remoteness for this kind of mythology and embellishment in addition to take over the historic core. We'll see you next time.